Thank you very much, and welcome to you all. Let me welcome you very formally here to this panel. I'm delighted to be back here at the Asan Plenum. This is my fourth time, and I came the first time right after the Arab Spring when we had a session and a whole plenum actually on the emergence of leadership or lack thereof, and of course, in particular, looking also at the Middle East. This panel is entitled Middle East and a Liberal International Order. And I think probably for a lot of us here, the notion of, or the conjunction of the two expressions, Middle East and liberal international order, must strike us as somewhat incongruous, particularly if we look at the region over the last few years. Indeed, as I'll argue in a minute, over the last few decades, what we have seen is an order that is anything but liberal in the Middle East. And of course, if you look at the contemporary Middle East, so all the way from, let's say, Algeria, Iran, Turkey, etc., what you see is a number of countries that I think by the standard definitions of a liberal international order simply would not really meet that definition. And I should also say, to kind of put this into perspective, and then I'll hand over the word to my colleagues, that the establishment of an illiberal order in the Middle East is really far-reaching and goes back far in time. Indeed, you can trace its origin back to the interwar period, the arrangements that were made both by the colonial powers and in opposition to the colonial powers, and then kind of fortified by events that took place during the Cold War, where the superpowers saw it in their interest very often to create quite illiberal regimes to serve their own interests. And the result, or the way that many people have explained this illiberal order in the Middle East, in addition to the historical dimension, has also, of course, been the nature of the resource base for a lot of the economies in the Middle East. The fact that, particularly in the Arab Gulf states that rely extensively on oil and natural gas for their sales, that in a sense, if you live in that kind of economy, you don't really need to hook into a liberal economic order, because you don't really depend on world markets, etc., entrepreneurship, and all of the things that come along with a liberal international order. And so the outcome, I think, in the Middle East has been, and in North Africa, has really been what Nazi Hayubi, who was, at least in my estimation, one of the best observers of the state in the Middle East, what he called a fear state, that is, states that have very heavily depended on coercive institutions to really perpetuate themselves at the expense of other institutions, regulatory, etc., that could have made them much more responsive to their respective societies. And so when the 2011 Arab Spring came around, everybody had hoped that, in a sense, this would break that kind of stalemate that we had seen in the Middle East for several decades, again going back to the interwar period. And what we saw, and I realize that most of my colleagues here will be quite pessimistic, both about the persistence of authoritarianism and illiberalism in the Middle East and what the outcome is. But I would also like to point out that in addition, of course, what we saw after the Arab Spring was, first of all, the re-emergence of what was often called the deep state, the reinforcement of illiberal orders. But I think we should also not forget that there were at least two pinpoints, I would call them, pinpoints of hope for the Middle East, represented by Tunisia, where a political regime reformed itself, where an Islamic movement was brought into the political system, and then that Islamic movement, that Islamic party, Nahda, and particularly the figure of Rashid al-Ranushi, were really instrumental in creating a kind of a modernized version of politics in Tunisia that really starts quite in contrast to what we saw in the Arab world. And I also would like to point out, for example, again, I wouldn't push this too far, but if you think of Morocco, for example, where Mohammed VI very proactively then, before the Arab Spring could jump over to Morocco, and took a number of measures, including the constitutional reform, etc., as a result of that Arab Spring. So not all, I think, is quite as pessimistic as we would like to portray it. But of course, we also have, and I hope we'll get into this a little bit later on, in the Middle East right now, a very, very interesting example of where a liberalism could eventually be replaced. And I'm talking specifically here, of course, of events in Saudi Arabia, where Mohammed bin Salman has taken the lead in reforming, hoping to reform his country. And a question, and I'm sure some of the panelists and myself and you as audience may have several questions about that. The real question here is, of course, to what extent you can move toward liberal order in a country like Saudi Arabia if essentially the political frameworks remains largely illiberal. So again, a kind of a dilemma, a contradiction that we'll want to talk about. As you can see, there are lots and lots of issues here to discuss this afternoon. Can the Middle East liberalize? Can it move toward a more liberal order? And if so, how can that be done? Or is there a role to be played here for outside parties in that process? The Tunisia example brings up the role of Islam in the possibility of reform. So lots and lots of questions to answer. And in order to help us answer some of those questions, I'm going to very briefly introduce my fellow panelists, and we're going to change very slightly the program from the way it's printed in the brochure that you have. We're going to start off as our first speaker with Dr. Joseph Joe Kéchichian. And Dr. Kéchichian is Senior Fellow at the Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, has also been, among many other things, an Associate Political Scientist at RAND Corporation and a Hoover Fellow at Stanford University, has written very, very extensively. I think anybody who reads anything about the Gulf is very familiar with the work of Dr. Kéchichian. Our second speaker will be Professor Mesut Özcan, and he is the director of the Diplomacy Academy of Turkey, as well as a professor of international relations of Social Science University of Ankara. He has been the deputy chairman of the Center for Strategic Research at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The third speaker will be Dr. Siavash Saffari, and he is an assistant professor of West Asian Studies and Political Science at Seoul National University, has started to publish very extensively, for those of you who are interested in Iran, a wonderful book, Beyond Shariati, Modernity, Cosmopolitanism, and Islam in Iranian Political Thought. So that is Professor Saffari. And then finally, and certainly not least of all, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jang, and she is the Senior Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa here at the Asan Institute, certainly has become one of the most prominent young scholars in the region, in Korea, on the region, and has been a policy advisor on Middle East issues to this country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So after this introduction then, let me perhaps ask Dr. Kéchichian to make the opening remarks. We've imposed a 10-minute limit on all of our speakers, hoping that we'll have sufficient time to come to the audience and give you the possibility to ask lots of intriguing questions for our panel. Dr. Kéchichian.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be back at Asan, an institution that is very dear to my heart, and I congratulate the Asan community for its 10th anniversary. I've written a few words which I will read to you, and then in the question and answer period will be more informal. In preparation for this conference, I took the time to reread The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama, who as early as 1992, that is barely a year after the collapse of the Soviet Union, wrote his triumphant opus. Many criticized the book when it was published, labeling it as an American utopia that glorified Western domination of the planet. Thierry de Montbrial, a French energy expert, went so far as to respond with his very famous La Revanche de l'Histoire, The Revenge of History, which warned Western capitalist economies of Keynesian preferences. Over a very short period of time, Russia re-emerged with force on the international scene, coupled with the newest wave of Islamist barbarism, a label that gained popularity in the aftermath of the post-2010 Arab Spring. In short, mankind lived through some epochal transformations over the course of less than 3 decades, and it seems that we are poised to witness even more fantastic changes in the coming few decades. Against the power of the liberal international order, in which the rules-based international order itself has operated for the better part of nearly 7 decades, it would be eminently fair to declare that ossified Arab societies confronted and are continuing to face very serious political and security challenges, all of which have denied in the past and are rebuffing nowadays prospects for peace and prosperity throughout the region. The so-called Arab Spring shook the region and enlarged existing divides across ethnic and religious fault lines with no prospects for serious resolutions. Country after next have confronted and undoubtedly will continue to face serious socio-political confrontations, some of which will be bloodier than what we have witnessed in certain societies. Poor governance, avowed neglect in the management of indigenous economies, and lack of accountability, among other shortcomings, allowed strongmen to rule with impunity that, mercifully, is no longer predictable or practicable. As dramatic transformations were ushered in and are underway now, even if most might take a certain period of time to unravel, we are now confronted with enduring violence, especially in Syria and Yemen, but also in Libya, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. It is therefore eminently fair to ask whether the Arab world will remain mired in perpetual chaos or whether it stands a chance to embark on the liberal international order bandwagon, as Fukuyama had predicted. The best way to answer this question is to concentrate on Syria, Iran, and the Gulf states, though an effort will also be made to assess the roles played by outside powers, and here I have in mind China, Russia, and leading Western powers that are very much involved in the Middle East and cannot seem to get out of the area, to see whether the region is increasingly confronted with illiberalism and condemned for irrelevance. What are some of the internal and global challenges that seem to prevent the liberal order from taking root in the Muslim world? Are illiberal order practitioners poised to keep nearly 500 million Arabs mired in perpetual misery? What are some of the forces that could break the cycle of poor governance, mismanagement, and unaccountability? Let me address first Syria. For over 7 years, most of the world has now focused on Daesh, or the Islamic State, the Arabic term Daesh, and preferred, yes, most of the world has preferred to ignore or at least overlook Bashar al-Assad, as if he is the answer to everything. While Vladimir Putin has glorified the Alawi minority regime, which will have a whale of a time to rule over all of Syria in the future, since the Damascus regime's portrayal of itself as the savior of minorities is less than persuasive, this has not prevented extremists who gained influence throughout the region. They will eventually reach Russia as well. Putin, I'm sure, knows this already. In Syria, all sides are guilty, though the sole group that is paying the price is the hapless Syrian people. The result of the ongoing war, and it's just at the beginning as far as I can see, which some journalists are seeing coming to an end, include A, demographic shifts, 2, de facto divisions that are likely to lead to a partition of the country, 3, the use of weapons of mass destruction, which seem to proliferate in abundance, even if Moscow successfully persuaded the hapless Obama administration in September 2013 that it would guarantee, through the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, their destruction. In fact, they were not destroyed, as we have seen recently. President Obama allowed himself to be hoodwinked, which further complicated matters, as we have now Russian troops on the ground in Syria, along with Turkish forces engaged against Kurdish elements along parts of the border, all of which includes also, one has to mention, the presence of American, French, and British troops in Syria as well. Now, turning back to Iran and the Gulf states, naturally, the single most critical factor in Syria is and will remain for the foreseeable future Iran, whose objectives are multifaceted and frightening as Tehran aims to remake the entire Arab and Muslim worlds into its preferred image. This is, of course, easier said than done, and we will see whether or not the era of empires is over or not. There will be no successors either to the Ottoman Empire or the Safavid Empire, though we might see a 30 years long war between Sunnis and Shias, even if few should rejoice at such catastrophes. My fear is that Syria's wars, and there are several kinds of wars going on in Syria, we'll talk about this in a second, will last much longer than some people assume, as many Western powers, along with Israel, are keen to see the Sunni-Shia clashes perpetuate. We are now living through exceptional times that allow creativity to overwhelm dictatorships, and while the current competition will take a while to unravel, the entire region is and will continue to experience rapid and meaningful changes. Although most of us are impatient, this is, after all, the Facebook, Twitter era, the need for liberty in the Arab world has never been this high. Starting with the 2005 Cedars Revolution in Lebanon and the Mohammed Bouazizi December 2010 immolation in Tunisia, Arabs have entered a new phase, even if setbacks in Iraq, Egypt, and Yemen, among others, may slow the process down. The more stable Arab Gulf states, on the other hand, opted for basic reforms whose aims include defeating extremism, the emancipation of women, and most importantly, the creation of wealth in preparation for the day after oil. What Arabs do not want are Iranian, Turkish, or Western domination over them or to decide for them. In Saudi Arabia, heir apparent Mohammed bin Salman adopted visionary steps, and one can only imagine the progress he might attain after he exceeds rulerships. Cynics or critics in general claim that Arab Gulf rulers are the Western world's best enemies or their worst friends. This is both insulting and wrong. What the new Arab Gulf leaders are after are genuine economic gains. What they reject is to let their development be guided by Western values, though they are eminently at ease with bilateral and multilateral alliances with these same powers. Francis Fukuyama, to close my points, anticipated many changes in his book, but he foresaw the need to make a few concessions in order to associate developing countries to the evolution of the Western world, ostensibly to gradually integrate them in a specific way of life and to westernize the world as much as possible, presumably to ensure Western security. Fukuyama predicted that peoples everywhere would rally to the Western spirit by adopting such mundane things as common clothes, music, consumer goods in general. He wanted to improve overall standards of living in the developing world precisely to limit security threats, and while some of that occurred, traditions have prevailed. Now, time will tell, even worse, whether truly Western values are alien concepts in the rest of the world, including in the Muslim world, or whether or not liberalism stands a chance even in the most traditional societies, which I contend it does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kéchichian. Professor Özcan.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Asan for this invitation. This is a very fruitful and enriching event. Enables us to come together with old friends and also benefit from ideas presented here. What I will say is also summarized to a certain extent by the moderator and also by Mr. Kéchichian. But the title of the event is the Liberal International Order. Are we having this Liberal International Order all around the world? And what I would say for the Middle East, unfortunately, even at the heyday of the Liberal International Order during the Cold War years, we didn't have a liberal international order in the Middle East. During the Cold War years, the region was very much a kind of arena of competition between two superpowers. So this prevented the emergence of a liberal international order, similar to that emerged in this part of the world, but at the same time, gradually in the southern Europe as well. But we didn't have a liberal international order during the Cold War years, even the heyday of this liberal international order. This is one of the reasons the Middle East is described as one of the most penetrated regions of the world. So there were superpower rivalries, there were also domestic rivalries among different actors in the region. So this prevented the emergence of such an order. And there were expectations right after the end of the Cold War, as it is described by Dr. Kéchichian. So there were the belief that this liberal international order will prevail all around the world after the end of the Cold War, after the demise of the Soviet Union. So we will have the only answer at the hand. So this will also prevail, spill over to the Middle East as well. But unfortunately, this was not the case during 1990s and 2000s. And what we witnessed with the Gulf War, with the unfolding events in the region, the continuing the Arab-Israeli conflict and other conflicts in the region, we didn't have a liberal international order, but perpetuation of the same order under the Pax Americana system. There was no Soviet Union to rival the United States, but on the other hand, the American system, the liberal international order, did not prevail with its institutions, with its values in the region. And we witnessed the same political figures, the same political atmosphere, the same political parties were ruling the region for many decades. And with the arrival of Arab uprisings or Arab Spring, so there was a hope to have a liberal order in the region, because when we look to the emergence of these events, there were lots of reasons of these Arab uprisings. It started in Tunisia, spilled over to other countries in the region. But when we look to the reasons of these uprisings, one of the most important reasons was the political participation and also political institutions. And on the other hand, in order to have a better life, a decent life, access to economic development, access to economic resources, fight against corruption, these were the demands of the people on the streets. And this is also very much related with the fact that these demands were mostly spelled out by the young people. We have a very young population, increasing population in the region, so they were having access to media, to other types of communication and media, so they know more about what are the alternatives to their lives, what are the people in different parts of the world having their lives, the economic activities, political participation. So they were asking the same. But unfortunately, this was not the desired result. At the end, we had maybe the reverse. We didn't have a liberal international, but we have a disorder. Not an order or illiberal order. We had disorder. There were lots of reasons. It's already said this is also very much related with patience. People of the region waited for a long time, so they expected to have these changes overnight in a short period of time. They were, hoping to have political participation, solution of the economic problems, access to political parties, everything. But on the other hand, as we all know, great expectations may also result in great disappointments. So what we had in the region is a kind of great disappointments on the side of the many different actors in the region. And this is also very much related with the lack of institutions, lack of culture. And as we all know, in order to have a liberal international order, a liberal order in a country, we should have political parties, functioning political system, and also this requires time to have these type of functioning political parties, and this in a gradual way, this develops a kind of culture in which people are bargaining with one another, people are establishing coalitions in terms of political, ideas, political, visions. So since we were lacking in the case of Arab uprisings in the region, so this resulted in a kind of clash. Instead of having, although I'm agreeing with the moderator, in the case of Tunisia, we had a success. This is also very much related with the, political figures there. The leaders like Mesut Merzouki, and also like Nahda leader Ghannouchi, they were capable to come together to bring their differences to a certain extent to establish some kind of coalition. But this was not the case in other parts of the region, so we ended up with a kind of disorder in the region, and this resulted in not only an illiberal order, but at the same time disorder in disintegrating states, at the same time disintegrating societies. Unfortunately, what we witness now is that people are not attached to their national identities, attached to nation states. These are very much problematic notions because normally nation states represent different segments of the society, and we all know in the region, unfortunately, this is not the case. For this reason, people are increasingly feeling attached to sub-state identities, ethnic identities, religious identities, or sectarian identities. So this is also a very negative thing in terms of having a liberal order, because without having institutions, without having this type of culture, we cannot have a liberal order in the region or in a given state. So as a result of all of these negative developments, unfortunately, we witnessed state failures in the case of Yemen, in the case of Libya, Syria, in other parts of the region. So this resulted in emergence of sub-state groups, terrorist groups, other types of activities, and also this enabled regional players, international players to try to influence the dynamics on the ground. So this is a very negative atmosphere. And as I said, without having these institutions, without having these values, we cannot have a kind of liberal order that we want to desire, that we want to have in the region. What should be done in terms of answering these challenges, in terms of having a kind of order first and a kind of liberal order in the region? First, we should address the security challenges of the people. So the first priority for all human beings is their security. But unfortunately, given the lack of security protection by the states in some countries in the region, so as I said, people are resorting to sub-state groups. So these are very challenging for the state system in the region. So first, there should be some kind of an understanding among the regional players, but at the same time international players, to come to an understanding to address these security challenges. It is easy to say, but difficult to implement this. But this should be the first priority. Second, there should be a kind of political participation to represent different groups in each society. One of the most important problems in the region is the underrepresentation of some political groups or overrepresentation of some others, politic-wise or ethnic-wise or religious-wise, whatever it is. So there should be representative, transparent political institutions. It's not that easy to implement this. And what is the most important factor the international community can play? There should be some kind of political and economic guidance here. What we witnessed in the case of East European transition, there was the political and economic guidance on the side of the European Union. Without having this political and economic guidance, there might be some problems in the East European transition. But in the case of Arab uprisings, we didn't have such a political and economic guidance. What I mean, in the case of EU, there were some criteria to be met in order to get to the club. So this is in terms of protecting human rights, minority rights, and also open market, functioning market economy. But in the case of Arab uprisings, so we didn't have such a guidance, political guidance. In terms of economic guidance, we all know the problems in the region also very much relate with the economic challenges, with the economic difficulties. And the problems of the region is also very much at the same time emerged and occurred with the global financial crisis. So there was no incentive on the side of the other countries, Europeans or maybe Americans and others, to provide financial assistance to the transition. So this was also one of the main challenges of the transition in the region. So there has to be some kind of economic contribution to this transition, but this was not the case. And in addition to this, there has to be some kind of international or regional understanding among the players to decrease the tension, because this is affecting not only the region, but at the same time, as we witnessed with the refugee issues, other parts of the world, and also with terrorist activities, not only affecting the countries in the region, but at the same time, other parts of the world. I try to be optimistic. There are some positive signals, as we witnessed in the case of Tunisia and in some other cases, but there are also lots of challenges, since this region is very much a penetrated region. There are stakes of different players, regional players, international players, so it will take time to address all of these challenges. But on the other hand, the Arab uprising started at a time when no one was expecting to have such a upheaval affecting all parts of the all segments, all corners of the region. So the demand is there. Most of the demands are not met, so the demand will be there. Since we have this demand, I hope there will be some kind of transformation in a gradual way to have a kind of order, and to have a liberal order in the region in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Özcan. And Dr. Saffari.
Thank you. I am grateful to the organizers for having invited me to this panel, even though I'm not a policymaker or an advisor, as many of my esteemed colleagues here are. I do teach political science and Middle Eastern studies, which, to give credit to Seoul National University, we call it West Asian Studies instead of Middle Eastern Studies, which I really like. Now, in both of these disciplines, in Middle Eastern Studies and in political science, there is a tendency to view the Middle East as an exception, as a region that's exceptionally prone to authoritarianism, that's exceptionally resistant to secularism, exceptionally resistant to modernity, modernization. And it seems to me like this, our panel today, our session today, is also somewhat premised on this idea of Middle Eastern exceptionalism. The presumption seems to be that the Middle East is somewhat of an exception to an otherwise liberal international order. Specifically, the recent events in the Middle East, the rise of the civil war in Syria, the conflict in Yemen, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, these are seen as challenges, as threats to this liberal international order that supposedly exists. What I want to do in the few minutes that I have, and hopefully we can continue this conversation in the subsequent part, is to question the veracity of this assumption. My main argument is that far from being an exception, the Middle East is a display case for changing dynamics in global power structures. Let me explain what I mean here. Liberal international order is often defined as an open and rule-based international order enshrined in institutions like the UN, in values such as multilateralism. But when we look at the Middle East in the post-World War II era, we would be hard-pressed to find any evidence, any trace of such a rule-based, institution-based, multilateralism-based order. It's not because the Middle East is an exception. Far from it. After World War II, the Middle East, like Southeast Asia, like Latin America, became one of the theaters of the Cold War. We know, for example, that in 1962, the missile crisis began when the United States placed its Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which then the Soviet Union retaliated by putting its missiles in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't call it the Turkish Missile Crisis. We also know that after World War II, the main proponents of the liberal international order, the United States and its European allies, supported, propped up, deeply illiberal, anti-democratic governments in the Middle East. In 1949, just a few years after the end of the World War, we had a CIA-backed military coup in Syria, which ousted the democratically elected government in that country. 4 years after that, in 1953, we had a CIA MI5-backed military coup in Iran, which ousted the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, replacing him with the Shah. 2 years after that, 1955, the US and UK create the Baghdad Pact, which props up deeply illiberal authoritarian regimes in Iran, in Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, etc. 3 years after that, we have Operation Blue Bat, where the US sends 14,000 troops to Lebanon to prop up the government of Camille Chamoun and to help him suppress the uprising by the country's Muslim population. These are just some examples. And this pattern also continues throughout the 1960s and 1970s. And by the time we get to 1979, 1980, the Middle East becomes perhaps the most decisive theater of the Cold War. And I'm referring obviously to the occupation of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union and the US policy of turning Afghanistan into the Vietnam of USSR by supporting radical jihadist Islamist groups. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is just to remind us that this liberal international order was never materialized in the Middle East after World War II. Even after the Cold War, what we see in the Middle East is more of the same, more overt and covert interventions, increased US unilateralism. This is the period that begins with the first Gulf War, continues with the Algerian Civil War, in which the US and its allies support the Algerian army. This is also the period where we see the occupations of Afghanistan, of Iraq. We see regime change in Libya, which went against the very UN sanction that authorized military operations in the country in the first place. We see non-UN sanctioned drone bombings in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia. We see the continued and unconditional US support for Israel, even when Israel has been and was blatantly in clear violation of UN resolutions and other supposed norms of the so-called liberal international order. Now, going back to the original argument that I began with, I think that what we're seeing in the Middle East today is not a shift from a liberal international order, which never existed, to an illiberal international order. What we're seeing is the regional echoes of an ongoing shift from a US-dominated unilateral global order to an emerging, open-ended, for the time being, multilateral order. And I think Syria is the clearest example of this. 7 years into the Syrian civil war, Bashar al-Assad, with critical support from Iran and Russia, have emerged as the winners of the war for the time being. And the US and its allies seem to have been sidelined, again, for the time being. Now, if the US has been sidelined or marginalized or plays a peripheral role in Syria, that's not by preference. We know that there is this myth almost in the United States, both among conservatives and liberals, that Obama, for example, didn't do anything about Syria. Well, the fact is that even during the Obama administration, the CIA was spending almost $1 billion a year in Syria, training and equipping Syrian opposition groups. And Obama also launched airstrikes in Syria, which were bigger or comparable to the airstrikes that we saw last April or the more recent one this month. I think what the Obama administration was trying to do quite wisely was in Syria, they were trying to avoid direct confrontation with Russia. And what we're seeing today under the Trump administration, despite the military rhetoric and despite the fact that in his tweets, Trump named Putin and threatened Russia, is that we're still seeing that policy of avoiding direct confrontation with Russia in Syria. And the very clear example of this was when United States and its allies bombed Syrian infrastructure, but announced in the same week that they're not going to introduce any new sanctions against Russia. So I think it's possible, not only is it possible, I think it's sensible, it only makes sense that we see all of these events as signs of this shifting global power structure. And I think for policymakers, perhaps here in Korea as well, it's important to recognize this shift and to sort of respond in their policies accordingly.
Thank you, Dr. Saffari. And then finally, Dr. Jang.
Thank you, Dirk. Okay, I also need to say that I'm so thrilled to have my old friends back and new friend too. And Dirk, when we first joined the first plenum, I used to be a young scholar, but I'm not anymore. It was like 8 years ago. So, okay, and before I jump into my speech, I wanted to present that the Asan Plenum's Middle East panel always wanted to cover the diverse voices, including Arab, Turk, Israel, and who am I missing? Iran. But today, somehow we missed Israel. It was not intention at all. I mean, somehow we sent the invitation twice, but they didn't make it. So I hope some of you wanted to, cover. Why are you laughing? Israeli voice. Okay, so when my boss, Dr. Ham, and my colleagues decide the theme of the year, like the illiberal international order, I think the illiberal regional order can be, these supporting evidence for our main argument. So right now, the Middle East can be summarized by the rise of Iranian hegemonic power as the leading illiberal Middle East order maker, I say. Okay, so given my over-focus on the rise of Iranian hegemonic power, my presentation covers only right after the defeat of ISIS and the ending of Syrian civil war. So let me cover 3 different actors. The first one is like illiberal states, including Syria, Iran, and Russia. And second player is the absence of liberal states, covering the United States and Western powers. And the third category is swing states, or confusing states like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi, and KRG. I'm so sorry for the Kurdish people. I mean, they really contributed a lot in the battle against ISIS, but they were just struck by their former supporters, I guess. And finally, I'd like to try to connect the illiberal Middle East order with its possible impact toward the Korean Peninsula. I know that you heard too many times about how critical the time period here in Korea is. So we are going to have 2 summits, and we are also going to observe the May 12th, the Iranian nuclear deal due as well. So let me try to connect the Middle East, the illiberal Middle East with Kim Jong-un. Okay, the first one, illiberal states in the Middle East. Syria, the second generation of hereditary success regime, the Bashar Assad regime, just used chemical weapons toward its own citizen, which is very illiberal, which is against the international norm. The Bashar Assad regime never ever by any values of liberal norms and international norms, say democracy, human rights, and rule of law, and free information floors, and open society at all. And who backed Assad regime? Russia and Iran. And Russia was there in Damascus and Syria forever, but then the rise of Iran's impact toward Assad is very critical, I guess. So, the presence of Iran in Damascus and Beirut and Baghdad and Sana'a was so something critical, I guess. So right now, the post-civil war order is led by Russia and, more importantly, by Iran and the hardliners of IRGC. I'm not a fan of, the, say, liberalist theory, meaning that I don't think the state is not a unitary actor at all. So when I mention Iran, I like to focus on the hardliners of the government, like IRGC. And so the IRGC is like dominating the Middle East right now. And the liberal states, or the absence of them, the United States is not really interested in intervening or helping or supporting or rearranging the Middle East anymore. Since the Obama administration, under the name of offshore balancing strategy, which is quite different from Trump, but the same direction they are leaving the Middle East. And also the West powers, the Europeans, they are so busy in dealing with their domestic issues and ultra populist and ultra-nationalist movement, and also the maximum interest of the Europeans toward the Middle East is like, the refugee issue. They try so hard, preventing the overflows of refugees, and that's it. So we are observing the withdrawal of European powers in the Middle East as well. And thirdly, the local actors, the swing states or confusing states. We have Turkey and Qatar, who used to be the pro-Western or semi-liberal bloc members, but not anymore. They are more interested in the new order led by Iran and Russia and Syria. So they are new members of illiberal regional order. And Saudi used to be very pro-American, the closed, diplomacy maker, but they're changing. I totally agree with Joe. Again, I don't think the top-down reform is the really best way to change the country, but if there is the only option, then you should stick to it. And I think MBS is on the right direction. At least, he's focusing on diversification, liberalization, and openness, and freedom, etc. So I expect we might witness the little, young member of new liberal state, the Saudi Arabia, and maybe UAE too. And finally, the confusing state would be KRG, Kurdish Regional Governance. Again, I feel so sorry for them. They fought so hard. Maybe they have their own intention or their calculation about bigger independence or whatever, but they did their duty, and the Western powers broke the promise. And of course, there's a domestic dispute within Kurdish community or Kurdish politics realm, but still, we really need to think about what we've done to KRG. And the only country who is supporting KRG right now is Israel. And I heard that Kurdish really didn't like it because there's too much attention. Israel is not really big supporter of international norms or international law, but then the Israel is the only supporter toward KRG independence. Then Kurdish people is like, okay, thank you, but so we should think about that issue too. And finally, what's the implication for Korean Peninsula in the era of the rise of Iranian hegemonic power in the Middle East? Not really good. Okay, we knew that Kim Jong-un has such a good friend, Bashar al-Assad. The third generation successive regime holder is a good friend of the second generation of successive regime holder. Their friendship was forever. But Iran also, yes, we know that there is connection, and we know that there's a smoking gun evidence between the Kim Jong-un and IRGC. I'm not talking about the Rouhani and reformist faction. And there is connection between the hardliner and Kim Jong-un regime, and Russia and China. So me as a Korean, and expecting the upcoming infamous summit, I'm really worrying the influence of the widespread illiberal Middle East order might have some impact toward the Korean Peninsula and might empower Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-un is always thinking about calculating about how his friends are doing in the Middle East, and I'm so worried about that too. And so, okay, let's go back to our main theme, illiberal international order. So given the lens of illiberal international order concept, we witnessed one phenomena in the Middle East recently, which is the airstrike by U.S., UK, and France toward Bashar Assad regime. And we are going to witness another Middle East-related event, the May 12th Iranian nuclear deal due. So I'm going to try to apply the theme of illiberal international order toward two separate events. The first, the strikes against Assad. Is it an act according to the liberal order or international norms? I think so. Even though the strike's just like a one-shot deal. I mean, the US says that not second time strikes, it's a one-shot strike, but still it's better than nothing, I believe. Because, actually, I was in Vancouver last year when Trump did the first strike toward the Assad regime, and there was one of the Syrian refugees in Vancouver, and he got the interview, and he said that he never imagined that he would say thank to Trump. And he said, thank you, because that gives kind of, hope signal to the miserable Syrians inside Syria. So I think that was done by liberal international order. But then what about the second event? The May 12th Iranian nuclear deal, killing or revision to will it be done by liberal international order or international norm? Because the deal was made by, led by the United States, but made by multilateral commitment by the European powers. So I really wanted to discuss about that issue. And my hunch is that the deal might be killed, or the deal might be harshly revised by the taste of Trump. But the Iranians, even the IRGC hardliners will accept the bad deal, I guess, because, from the beginning of the year, we even witnessed the rise of Iranian domestic protest toward the IRGC. So I can see the liberal, order rising from the bottom, within the Iranians, especially young generation. So, if you wanted to talk about that, I might want to join your further discussion. Thank you, Diederik.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very rich panel, I think, and raised lots of very, very interesting questions, and I'm going to try to open it up to all of you as quickly as possible. I just, to get the debate started, wanted to raise one question. It seemed to me that on the panel here we had some divergence in terms of thinking whether or not any kind of move toward a more liberal order in the Middle East is possible or not. And I, particularly as Professor Özcan was mentioning Tunisia again, and the relative success of Tunisia, and again that remains a pretty volatile situation by itself, despite all the progress that they've made. But it seemed to me that what made the Tunisian transition possible, and the Islamists coming in and then giving up power, really relied on an institutional history within Tunisia that goes back literally 7-8 decades. And remember that the whole point about Habib Bourguiba was this establishment of the rule of law, and the kind of institutional development of Tunisia that eventually led to the kind of accommodation that was possible after 2011. I don't see this kind of institutional divergence, and I don't want to get into Fukuyama and kind of the repeat of the modernization theory and all of that, but I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Kéchichian, Because you seem to be the most positive, the most optimistic of all of us that change is imminently possible. And then once you've given your answer, it would be nice to hear Dr. Özcan and then Professor Saffari kind of respond in turn to that.
Somehow we are always under the impression that liberalism was invented in the West just a few years ago. The Muslim world had liberal tendencies. People forget history, but the Abbasid Empire that ruled from 750 to 1250 was probably one of the most liberal empires that ever crawled on this planet. And it was under the Abbasid rule that the renaissance of the Muslim world took off, essentially. Now, of course, empires have a tendency of being taken over by similar empires and being destroyed, and this is exactly what happened over the course of history. What replaced, and I agree with you 100% that the Cold War played a critical role in stifling liberalism in the Arab and Muslim world, but really think about the fact that what came out of the pre-Cold War era in the Muslim world, when the empires collapsed, were either monarchies or dictatorships. This is before the Cold War started. Now, by definition, a monarchy cannot be a liberal democracy. By definition, it can eventually grow into a constitutional monarchy, which is my contention. I see the surviving 8 monarchies of the Arab world, the 6 Gulf countries plus Jordan and Morocco, to actually go that route as a constitutional monarchic systems. And on the other hand, dictatorships cannot be liberal democracies by definition either. But the good news about dictatorships is that none of them lasts. None of them last. You show me a single example of a military dictatorship that has survived. Eventually they will collapse because people will not put up with that kind of abuse. Now we are in the throngs of this dramatic change that is underway right now throughout the Arab world. The Arab world is boiling. It is changing dramatically. Those of us who live in the Arab world and who experience the tremendous clashes that are going on, not at the political level. At the political level, that's a marginal issue. The real changes are occurring at the popular level, at the people level. And Fukuyama, in his opus, as a former colleague of Francis, with whom I have debated many times when he was writing this book at Rand, I've always disagreed with him. You know, in his book, of course, he was talking about Europe and the European context. He makes the claim in the book, and it was very good that I reread it last year to refresh my memory. He makes the point that liberalism, he means Western liberalism, vanquished religion in Europe. That's what he claims. If you don't believe me, read it. And the fact of the matter is that we're talking in the Muslim world, we're talking about the tremendous power of Islam. If you don't understand this, you will not be able to understand the clashes that are going on in the Muslim world. There are liberal voices in the Muslim world today. Tunisia is one. There are others as well. And they will eventually win over against the extremists. The extremists are few. Don't assume that 1.5 billion Muslims are extremists. This is hogwash. How many terrorists are there? How many extremists are there? Have you counted them? 10, 50, 1,000, 1 million? We're talking 1.5 billion people on earth. And therefore, you have to take matters as scholars, we have to take matters from a longer perspective and evaluate this in the context in which it is growing. Liberalism will stand a chance to succeed. It might not be the Western liberal model, but it will be a liberal model, which means that people, ordinary people, will have better life, they will have institutional coverage, without renouncing their traditions and their religion.
Thank you. And I wonder if Professor Özcan would want to say one word. And I was particularly struck by your remark, of course, it's the, to kind of paraphrase Karl Brown's book, you know, that the Middle East is kind of a subsystem of the world, and the kind of difficulties that that introduces for reform, and then have Professor Saffari kind of pick up on that as well.
Yeah. As it is discussed during the panel, during the Cold War years, since the region was a kind of arena for bipolar rivalry, we didn't have the support of the, let's say, Western world to have this type of institution that will enable to emergence of this type of liberal international order. But on the other hand, I'm agreeing with Dr. Kéchichian that definitely there is a demand. The Arab uprisings emerge out of these demands. And with the young population, with the communication with other parts of the world, so there is, the genuine demand is there. But on the other hand, what was the problem here that we are facing now? People of the region waited for a long time, and they wanted to have this change in a very quick period of time. But unfortunately, the existing problems in the region are so daunting, so huge that it's not that easy to overcome these political challenges, economic challenges, social challenges overnight. And here, there has to be some kind of, as I try to summarize, there has to be some kind of political and economic support. But this was lacking. And if we had a kind of support from international community to have this type of gradual transformation, so we might have a kind of success. And if we look to the other examples in different parts of the world in terms of having a kind of liberal international order, we definitely have the engagement of other actors. If we look to the case of East Asia, North Korea, South Korea, so here the engagement of the Western countries, United States, is very crucial for the success of this emergence of a liberal order in this part of the world. Or if you look about the Southern European countries, if you look to the Eastern European countries, definitely there is a kind of engagement by different actors in terms of transition towards a liberal order. And here I try to talk about this type of engagement, but at the same time emergence of some kind of institutions, and also in a gradual way this culture. And you refer to the Tunisian examples. I also asked the same question to Ghannouchi himself in my academic research, because everyone is talking about the success in Tunisia and the failures of other countries. And some people are addressing, or some people are giving the personalities as the example, as the answer. Personalities of Ghannouchi, personalities of Merzouki and some others. So, and also their engagement with the liberal values in Western world, in Paris, in London. So this might play the role. But on the other hand, as you suggested, Tunisia was much advanced in terms of the institutions and also education level, access to internet and other types of, let's say, gradual development. In comparative with Libya, with other countries, they were much more advanced. So, and the level of education, graduation of university, so they had a kind of much higher ground in terms of having a success. And on the other hand, in other cases, in Syria, in Yemen, in other places, we had some other types of problems. And on the other hand, we should not forget that Tunisia was much kind of a monolithic country in terms of ethnicity and also sectarian terms. So if we look at other examples, in the case of Yemen, in the case of Syria, we have some other factors that also prevailed a kind of transition towards a liberal order. So these are all affecting, and also at the same time, we should not forget that not everyone is, I say, accepting or expecting such a liberal transition. I'm referring to the regional and international players. So there are also some countries, some players who do not want to have a kind of such an order. So these are also enabling, as you suggested, to small group of minorities terrorizing the people, benefiting from this environment, and also negatively affecting the future of the countries in the region.
Professor Saffari, would you want to say a word?
Yeah. Obviously, to pick up on that, institutions are very important. Tunisia is a good example for that. I think Alfred Stepan's work is very informative on that front. But I'm very glad that Dr. Kéchichian, you mentioned the popular movements. Because when we look at the Middle East today, and as pessimistic as I might have sounded in the first part of my comments, when we look at the ground, what's happening on the ground, on the streets of these countries, there are many signs to be hopeful, right? I think one example is Rojava in Syria, and the example of very innovative, creative models of democracy which are setting an example worldwide the same way that in Brazil or in India, the direct democracy examples really set an example in the late 90s and early 2000s. I think Rojava has been the example for our time of new innovations in democracy. Unfortunately, it has been under attack by external factors, by Syria, by Turkey, and by other actors. In Palestine today, right now we see this peaceful movement of tens of thousands of Palestinians living under occupied conditions in siege, peacefully protesting against Israeli siege and occupation. And again, we see that there is an attack on them by Israel, supported by the US. But that's a hopeful sign on the ground that despite living in the condition of siege and occupation, we can see such a strong civil society and such a strong popular movement. Of course, in Iraq, too, there is another example. Iraq, a country that has been invaded, occupied, the rise of ISIS, the destructive role of Iran. However, we see that despite all of these factors, there is some resemblance of democracy. There is a continuous movement towards democratization. Very recently, the coalition that was made between Muqtada al-Sadr and the Communist Party. That was a very interesting shift. We talked about ethnic sort of divides, religious divides. Here is a move that could potentially really challenge those ethnic and religious divides in Iraq. And of course, to go before a few years earlier. We had the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, the Arab Spring, the Gezi Park protests in Turkey. And of course, there are both internal and external factors that are trying really hard to suppress these movements, but the fact that they have existed, they have continued, despite all of these external and internal factors, I mean, that's what gives me hope.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Jang, did you want to add a word at this point? Or?
No, I don't want to
Okay.
ruin this, hopeful,
Sure.
positive.
Oh, please do.
Okay, can I? Really? Are you sure? I really enjoyed the plenary panel, the geoeconomics, where Dr. Walter Russell Mead said that the China and Iran are the main example of the illiberal international order. And then he said that, but then Iran's job is much easier to compared to China because Iran is just dealing with so many failing Middle Eastern states. So Iran just easily became a hegemonic power, whereas China is fighting with Japan and South Korea is like a tough competing countries. So if we are really I do recognize there is really deep, tradition of civil society in Tunisia and even in Algeria and in Turkey, Iran and everywhere. But then why we are still, witnessing the rise of Iranian hardliners?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Jang. I would suggest we open it up to the public. I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions that we haven't even been able to even remotely approach. Please, yes.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much for an extremely informative session. To all the panelists, it was a great learning experience for all of us. I have two questions. First of all, if I believe in there are organic changes are always the ones that last. So what is the role of foreign powers, or what is the role that you see of foreign powers now in the current hotbed that Middle East has become already? Previously, it has all been very divisive, the role that foreign powers have played. But what should now be the engagement or activity that US, Russia should engage to bring peace to the Middle East? And related to that, extension of that, the chair raised the question that is there a possibility of rise of liberal order? I would ask, is it even desirable, given right now the process that Middle East would have to go through, or that we are witnessing, it is going through. So should it be a more organic process where everyone waits out a natural evolution and everyone steps out of the region? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Shall we take 2 or 3 questions and then come back? Yes, please.
Yeah. Also, two questions too. You mentioned the rise of Iran. I wanted to also to have your views on the Putinization of Erdogan. And second question is, from Kim Jong-un's point of view, there was a Gaddafi precedent, which was quite significant for him, and I wanted to know what would be the impact of revisitation of the Iran deal just weeks ahead of the Trump-Kim meeting.
Sure. And shall we take another question before? Please, yes. Right here. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. My question to Prof. Jang, what do you mean exactly by the confusing state or countries? And you mentioned Qatar and Turkey. And my second question, to what extent the international interest can play a role in shaping the picture of liberal international or illiberal international order? Thank you.
Okay. And maybe one final question before we answer some.
Actually, I have 3 questions, maybe just 2. So whenever we talk about the Middle East, the media always say like the Shia-Sunni frame. Okay, there will be maybe the rise of the Iran. Okay, but I found that the yesterday session, like, China, like you are the enemy of the liberal world, but actually the China get the benefit from the liberal order, maybe Iran as well. So do you think that there's a real threat from the rise of the Iran beyond the IRGC? Or is it just the scapegoat of the contention between the Saudi and Iran, and we just disguise this frame? That's my second question is there is the fragmentation of the identity and the decline of the state identity. What about the civil identity? Because those people after the Arab Spring, they have a sharing memory as a civil movement. That sharing memory can be another form of the civil identity.
Very good. Shall we get started maybe on the foreign intervention, foreign powers? Dr. Özcan, do you want to very briefly repeat some of your earlier answer?
Yeah. As I tried to summarize during my remarks, the Middle East has been an arena of competition, and this was the case during the Cold War years, and also even after the Cold War years. So this is still the case. If you look to the case of Syria today, it's a kind of competition between different regional and international players. So this is a kind of foreign powers role here. And here what I was referring to this role of the international players, I'm referring to a kind of, let's say, positive role. I mean, in order to have this kind of institutionalization of some of these factors, some of these values, because this is also at the interest of other countries, other regions as well. And what we witnessed as the outcome of the failure of state institutions in the region is emergence of terrorist groups and also emergence of large segments of society immigrating to other parts of the world. So these are creating problems for domestic countries, but at the same time, regional and international countries as well. So if we have a kind of support, engagement in a positive way to have some kind of functioning political system, representative, accountable political system, then this is good for the countries of the region, but at the same time, this is good for the international players as well. For this reason, I'm referring to a kind of engagement of foreign powers in a positive way to institutionalize. Definitely, as you said, this should be an organic process. But on the other hand, as I said, sometimes it's better to have some kind of assistance in that direction as well, political and economic assistance. These are good, and as we witness in other parts of the world, there are some positive examples here as well. Even being a member of the European Union, then you may have some other challenges, as it is discussed during the European Union panel. But on the other hand, even if it to be an organic process, this was the organic demand by the youth of the Arab uprising. So, but in order to have this organic transformation, there will be some kind of positive support, political support, economic support, or let's say some institutional support. This will enable the transformation in a smooth way, and at the same time it will be beneficial for domestic, but at the same time the international players.
Thank you very much. Another question, one of the other questions was about Dr. Kéchichian, please.
No.
On identity,
Sunni,
the breakdown of identity.
And the Sunni-Shia clash.
Yes, yeah.
This is a key question. As I've said in my remarks, lots of people are salivating at the idea that there will be a 30 years long war between Sunnis and Shias. My view is the following. Iran, which is a predominantly Shia country, is not a religious threat in the Muslim world. Let me repeat that. Iran is not a religious threat in the Muslim world. Shias represent 10% of Muslims around the world. 90% are Sunni Muslims, so therefore there is no threat there. From the religious point of view, there is a threat from Iran that is perceived by the rest of the Muslim world, especially the Arabs, in terms of its revolutionary zeal. That is, the Iranians are very much interested, quote unquote, in liberating occupied Mecca and Medina. Shall I repeat that one more time, just so that it sinks in? Revolutionary Iranians would like to liberate Mecca and Medina from the usurpers, the Al Saud and their followers, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a political threat. This is a genuine political threat. And of course, when you have individuals who make those kinds of statements, or in Lebanon, for example, Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese party that has members of parliament, members of the government, but it's also the mouthpiece of the Iranian government. Hezbollah does not have one iota of independence. It essentially parrots what the Iranians want them to do. Fine. I mean, this is a political process. Lebanon is, whether we like it or not, the only Arab liberal democratizing society, even though it is under threat, no doubt about that. But nevertheless, this is part of the debate that goes on. The Sunni-Shia clash is not going to happen on religious grounds. It's going to happen on political grounds. And I don't think this is in the interest of Muslims to actually go down that path. And it seems to me your second question about the identity is also very crucial. And I fully agree with you that sharing memories is something that can seal that type of identification. But as Mesut said earlier, and I agree with him 100% on this question, that could only happen, the memorization could only happen when people believe in the institutions and the education levels go up. This is why Tunisia is a success story, relatively speaking, because of the very high education levels. Incidentally, the Lebanese butchered each other for 30 years in the war. Of course, the war is not finished yet, mark my words, and they have never reconciled. There has never been any kind of reconciliation between people from all walks of life, Muslim, Christian, rich and poor, leftists and rightists. They've never reconciled. There is not even a single museum to commemorate the dead, 150,000 dead in the war. The history books of Lebanon stopped in 1975. Nothing happened after 1975. The children don't learn anything after 1975. History stopped in 1975. Therefore, this identity problem will unfortunately not be addressed. We'll have to wait.
Sorry, did you want to follow up, or? Okay, and then kind of following up on that, Dr. Kéchichian, for the panel in general, because the issue was raised of the resurgence, in a sense, of identity politics and the resurgence of primordial politics within the region, which stands quite in contrast to the kind of Fukuyamian ideas that we talked about. Anybody want to talk about that? Is that an issue in the region at this point?
Dirk, I think I have one question to answer.
Sure.
The gentleman asked me about the impact of welcoming the Iranian deal toward the North Korea. Was it your question? Let me just quickly answer
please go ahead.
the
Yes.
question. Either way, the killing or not killing, the Iranian deal, I mean, the May 12th will be giving Kim Jong-un really big pressure. Okay, the deal might be killed given the logic of, thorough denuclearization without any sunset condition by Trump, or the deal. The deal will be killed despite the European diplomatic whatever trying, or the deal might be merely survived only thanks to the pressure from the bottom of Iranian society. I know that the Iranian, how should I put? I don't want to put Iranian government because Iranian government is so-called the reformist, the Iranian deep state or IRGC started their own propaganda. For the last 3 months that they are ready to do, restore resistance economy, and they are not worried about any, the renewing sanctions at all. But we know that they are worrying, and because even their traditional constituency of hardliners are changed their mind. I mean, the older protesters these days on Iranian streets are not from the young middle class generation, but from the traditional constituency of the religious people. So if and when the deal which is made, which is like suitable for the Trump's taste, is like a toast over Iran, then Iranian IRGC might unwillingly to accept it because they are worrying about the domestic audience cost, and that is very huge. So in the end, either way, Kim Jong-un will get very big pressure after May 12th, I guess, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Please,
yes. On this identity issue.
Yeah.
In the region, we didn't have fully functioning nation states even before the Arab uprising. So we cannot talk about people are fully attached to a national identity in different countries. People were still having their tribal, local identities or ethnic or religious identities, but at the top of it, there was a kind of nation state representative to a certain extent, and people were feeling attached to this. But with the state failures in some states, we witnessed emergence of sub-state identities, national ethnic identities, or even group identities, village identities, because with the failure of states to protect its own citizens, so we witnessed emergence of militia groups, military groups under different names. So they were claiming to represent and to protect different groups, ethnic group, religious groups, whatever it is. So then in a gradual way, people started to feel much more attached. You are referring to a supranational identity among different groups, youth in the region, via communication, via internet, via other things. But on the other hand, there are also sub-state identities operational at the same time. Currently, I'm also doing some kind of public opinion research for my own academic writings. And if you ask the people in different countries, they are very much tired of these type of ethnic and religious identities. For example, there will be an election in Iraq in a couple of weeks. So when you go and ask the people there, in a couple of years ago, they were mostly feeling attached to their sectarian or religious or whatever identity. But as a result of all of the bloodshed, all of the insecurity in the region, now people are thinking about, in other terms, in a much global or regional terms. So people do not feel only be described or only to be attached some sub-state identities. So you referred to these supranational identities, but this is unfortunately not true for everyone. This is true maybe for the educated class, for the people who have access to internet, who have access to international media channels, so they can have some kind of attachment with other fellows, young fellows in different countries. But for others who are, let's say, underdog, who are having less and less economic opportunities, less education, they don't have access. They don't have access to electricity. So how can we expect them to have supranational identity, communicating with others? This is the case for some groups in Egypt, in Tunisia, in other parts of the region, but this is a kind of minority. For other segments of the society, it is between their national identity and sub-state, sub-national identity. But as a result of all of these negative developments, so they also realized that it is not possible to have only sub-state identity to protect their identity. So now I see there is a much more interest to have a nation-state, representative, accountable nation-state, representing different segments of the society, providing services, very basic services to them. So this is the general expectation on the different societies in the region.
Very good. I think, yes, please, Professor Saffari.
Yeah, if I may quickly, just to comment on Professor Ji-Hyang's previous comments on Iran, I agree with you that the Islamic Republic and the Sepah Pastaran, IRGC, they have been on a quest for regional hegemony for quite some time. But I think I have two reservations or two qualifications. One is that we have to distinguish between each case, the different countries or different spheres of influence that Iran has in the Middle East. In Syria, Iran is a major actor, no question about it. In Iraq, thanks to the American invasion and occupation, Iran became the major actor, major mover and shaker. But in Yemen, for example, there is definitely an exaggeration about the role of Iran, right? In Lebanon, yes, there is Iranian influence, but not to the same extent as Syria or Iraq. In Afghanistan, there is Iranian influence, but not to the same extent. So again, I think we have to be specific that we're talking specifically about Syria and Iraq as the major spheres of influence that Iran has. Now, the second qualification that I would add is if the IRGC, if the Iran and the Islamic Republic in general, if they cannot maintain control within the country, if they cannot respond to rising economic grievances, political grievances, social grievances, then their regional position is easily jeopardized. The Islamic Republic is fast losing the support of both middle class and lower classes. The Green Movement in 2009 was a clear indication that they had lost the support of the urban middle class. The recent protests, December 2017, January 2018 protests, were a clear sign that they're fast losing the support of the lower classes. Now, the challenge for popular movements would be that the Green Movement, which was led mostly by urban middle class and was a democratic liberal movement, completely ignored the demands of the lower strata of the society, economic demands, right? So when the recent protests by the poor people started, many of the chants indicated that they have no faith in the reform movement, in Khatami, Musavi, Rouhani, and the whole ilk, right? So if the democratic movement, if the democratic liberal movement manages to link itself, align itself with the recent movement of the poor people, there is hope for the future of Iran. If these groups, if these two groups, the middle class and the urban poor, cannot link their movements and their demands together, then the future is very bleak. We could potentially see the rise of a military and militaristic state in Iran, which would be one of the worst case scenarios, but we could imagine all kinds of other scenarios as well.
What's your prediction? I mean, what's your hunch? God, what's your gut?
I have very little faith in the leaders of the democratic liberal movement. I don't think that they're attentive enough to the demands of the lower classes. The comments were very revealing when the movement of the poor people started. Many of the leaders of the democratic movement, who have been under pressure themselves, they demanded that the state suppresses the movement of the poor people. I mean, not a very atypical attitude for liberals generally, but in Iran it could have particularly important and dim consequences.
Sounds very similar to those Arab Democrats or Arab liberals as well. I mean,
Yes.
Unfortunately, I have to bring this to a halt. Let me thank, first of all, Dr. Jang, Dr. Kéchichian, Professor Özcan, and Professor Saffari. And of course, thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed the panel.
Thank you.
We will now take a 15-minute coffee break. The last session of the Asan Plenum 2018 will take place in Grand Ballroom 1 at 3:15. Thank you very much.